All right, we're live again because I screwed that last one up. Um, who are you?
So I'm Richard Landers, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. I am an industrial organizational psychologist, which is the psychology of the workplace. And my major area within work is studying employee selection, employee assessment, and employee learning. I'm specifically interested in the kind of intersection point between technology and those areas. I've done most of my work in the area of gamification, starting to do a little bit more work in the last couple years, I'd say, on games. And also started in the last year or so on artificial intelligence, machine learning, broadly speaking, among all of the areas of my research. The goal is to sort of figure out what's real and what's not. So a lot of organizations tend to they buy a technology because everybody else is using it. We saw this with gamification, especially a couple of years ago, where it was like, we need to gamify. And if you ask them why, they had no answer. So trying to help organizations see where the actual value lies, that just because you used it badly and it didn't work doesn't mean it's useless. Just because everybody else is using it doesn't mean it's good for you. Trying to help organizations, walk that line, figure out what is really good for them and what isn't.
So that I already have like 1,000 questions, so that was a fantastic opening.
Oh, great.
So I'll just say I first became aware of you, I guess, because this is the first time we're really like speaking. We've DM'd and we've messaged on
Sure.
Twitter, but like the seeing you in motion and not just like a static avatar, this is a whole new world for me.
Sure.
But I gotta say, it was probably like 2015, 2016. You were at OD. Um, Bo Armstrong and Andrew Colmus were both still students of yours.
Mhm.
Um,
Andrew
I
still is.
really
Yeah.
did he like change doctoral programs and go over to?
No, so when somebody gets a new job in academia, you basically have the choice as to what to do about it with all your students. So I brought over a couple of my students. Andrew was at dissertation stage, so he would have to redo a bunch of class requirements. So I was like, you shouldn't come with me. That's a bad idea for you. But I told him that if he wanted me to keep, advising on his dissertation, even in an unofficial, unpaid capacity, that I was happy to do that. But he simultaneously got a job at Facebook. And that takes up a lot of time, as it turns out. So
Yeah.
he's still doing his dissertation. We actually talk like once a week about his progress.
Nice.
So I'm pretty sure he'll get done. But it's definitely been a while.
Yeah, it's funny. So he's in Austin. I know that much.
Mhm.
Uh, because I was also in Austin, and despite being there for 18 months, we never ended up meeting up. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, great. Literally my one good opportunity to meet one of you in person. And yeah, I shat the bed on that one. Anyway, so yeah, I don't really know how I first really became aware of you, which is all. It's like as soon as I became interested in gamification, game-based learning, like the intersection of play and IO,
Mm.
um, you were pretty much the very first person I think I ever discovered in whatever way who occupied that space, and you very much lived large in my imagination as a figure. And frankly, going through your body of work in preparation for this, I mean, yeah, you have done. Yes, I noticed in the past couple of years some of the papers moving away from that a little bit, being less explicitly about it. But yeah, I was outside thinking just before this, and I was like, what? How does someone exist who produces the work you want to produce, and but they're not you, right? But it mirrors your actual interests very, very closely. Um, that's a very top level question. I don't know that there is any possible answer to it. Um, but yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. You make really, really interesting work, and I'm glad to be able to have you on because I can't speak to, if you go to PSYOP, like, or use some hot shit, I have no fucking idea. But if if I drop your name in the dev circles or the designer circles or the publisher circles that I run in, people won't necessarily know you. And I've always felt that was kind of a shame, because these different verticals, yeah, they're different, right? Games for fun, games for work, games as philosophy, they occupy different spaces, but they often end up asking many of the same questions without realizing that, for 5 years, somebody's been out there answering it. And you don't have to start from scratch. You have all this grounding, and, maybe work as it applies to, assessment, or games as it applies to assessment, or games as it applies to the recruitment function, or whatever. That's not quite the same as, how do I, as an indie dev, get character sheets to be more reflective of the choices individuals take.
Yeah.
But they're not actually that different in their underpinnings. It's just the focus that's changed. Rambling.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that. So at this kind of level, one has to make choices about which communities that they really invest in. And so I have distinctly invested in the IO community, like time-wise. So I'm, for example, I'm a program chair at the conference for next year. So I get to decide who gets in, for example, which is not a position that one gets to without some degree of notoriety, I guess.
Yeah.
I think I have spent more time in the IO space than others, and part of that was the challenge of it, where I think early on I remember having a conversation with Scott Nicholson about his trajectory. I don't know if you know Scott, but yeah. So
we don't know each other, but I know who he is.
Yeah. So Scott is in sort of this like blendy, interdisciplinary-ish kind of space, including with his job. And it was a decision that he very actively made to kind of move into that space so that he would have and be rewarded career-wise with connecting with different communities. So I did not. I stayed in psych. And psych does not really reward interdisciplinarity even now, even with all of the emphasis and attention on it. So it became sort of my personal mission, along with a colleague of mine, Tara Barrand, to basically convince the entire field of IO psychology that not just games, but technology in general were worth paying attention to. Because the bias is that for psych folks, it's like, well, we really only care about mental processes and behavior. Like the tech is just kind of background noise. We don't actually care about any of that. It's really about the people. And we came in saying, well, it's kind of about both. And, they interact with each other in a lot of really clever ways that most psychologists don't really appreciate, even now. So we both invested very heavily in this, like, let's convince IO of what it's doing wrong kind of angle. And IO is just by nature a smaller community, where the full field is more valuable in the larger the organization gets, the more impact we tend to have. So it's just a smaller audience. I would say, yeah, I'm one of those people that gets stopped every 10 feet at the PSYOP conference, which, it's good and bad, I guess. It was weird when it started happening. I was not ready for it. I remember, and one of my grad students rips on me every time, former grad student, she's graduated, but she like makes fun of me every single PSYOP conference because she was present. We were hanging out at like the hotel bar at like 1 a.m. And some like first year grad student walks up and goes, "Are you the Richard Landers?" I'm like, yeah. So like it's nice to like that people have that kind of association, but it was not something I was like looking for. And it's been kind of weird. Like I'm pretty introverted, have pretty it used to be worse, but have like a good moderate case of like social anxiety still even these days. So it was, I don't know, it's been weird how it's happened, but it's entirely been within the IO community. I haven't really reached out too far beyond that, with a couple of exceptions where I did dip into what I would call the core academic gamification community, like Yuho Hamari and Leonard Nacke and
the Saga people.
Yeah, and so I went to some of their stuff. Like I went to Finland and like gave talks and met people up there, and that really encouraged me to publish a little more broadly. I guess you probably have seen some of that work, but yeah, some of the more general audience stuff, which has just has a bigger audience because there's more people that care about it. So I've tried to kind of walk that line over a long time. I don't know. In recent years, I think that I/O has become more exciting because of the sudden attention on testing and artificial intelligence. So we've been doing stuff with like virtual interviews and
No, I can still hear you.
No.
Oh,
We're back?
I'm back.
There we go.
Oh, that was close. Okay. Virtual interviews.
Yeah, we've been getting into that space because suddenly there's a lot of, general attention and also a lot of like human well-being dimensions to virtual interviewing.
Sure.
Of like, can an interview AI be racist, as like just a personally interesting question to me.
Yeah.
And what does it mean, and what are the societal dimensions of it, and what are the technical dimensions, and so on. So that's why we've kind of, at least in my lab, shifted kind of in that direction. We've also shifted more towards games themselves, which I like gamification sort of. It's just, it is a limited toolkit in a way that you can't create the same kind of experiences that you can in games and the same kind of immersion. So we have a National Science Foundation grant to look at virtual reality facilitated interactions. Okay. We've got, I've been trying to get an assessment game that sort of takes the core gameplay mechanics of Papers, Please, and converts it into a virtual reality environment. And then it basically uses it a way to assess whether people can handle stress and how well they adapt to change on the fly, and to actually get like psychometrically meaningful information about their stress tolerance. So all those projects, though, take more time and investment. A gamification project I could launch I could get done in 6 months, and the games projects, it's years. So that's part of why you've seen that shift in the publishing history, because I've edged away from gamification, and as we ramp up games, it's so much more time to get those projects off the ground.
You say the interest is definitely changing. There are more eyes on I/O. It is in some ways sexier. I/O is handling certain topics that people actually care about for once, outside of, coaching and training functions or baseline human capital management stuff. Have you seen the private organization rather than academic interest shift in the same way? Because I imagine when you're looking at, game-based projects rather than just gamification projects, time is obviously an issue, but so is funding and talent, right? If you could get, I think about, not necessarily as an example of someone I would want on this, but like Eline Media, right? Like a full video game developer, they have a stated mission of doing, interesting, creative, non-purely games as fun things with their development. But that's millions and millions of dollars and dozens of highly trained staff. That's outside the scope of basically any research project that isn't, something trying to solve the imminent end of mankind. So where have you found, and this isn't the right way to phrase it, but where have you necessarily found like success in pitching these things, or where are the eyeballs that also have the wallets to make it real?
Yeah, games is a lot harder than AI. I will start with that. In the AI space, there's essentially unlimited interest right now, which is which makes sense because it's now sort of infiltrating every aspect of life. So that's fine. Games is an interesting problem in terms of funding. So we have. Let me step back. So we've done one NSF project that did create games, and we actually did partner with a game developer. But convincing NSF reviewers / program officer that the total budget for game development needs to be more than like maybe $100K is essentially impossible. So that it really limits what you can do.
That's a great budget if you're trying to make like an analog game.
Yeah.
I can make a board game for that much money.
Yeah. So the game we ended up making was very like Flash game level, not very polished. We barely iterated at all. Like there were maybe 2 prototypes. So it's that's the kind of thing that happens in that space. And actually, I mean, honestly, a lot of the academic research in general has that same problem. That when you're reading these research papers, it's like, well, we tried to make a thing and it was, a grad student alone in their apartment for endless hours donating their time. And we made one version and it sort of worked. End of study. So that's...
Thanks.
Yeah, it's fine. I look at those papers and like I see exactly why that happened, but it is a little depressing. So so I will admit that the lack of resources is a pretty major reason why I've turned more in this AI space. But at the same time, there are ways to blend AI in games, I think, that are making it more attractive across the board. So one direction in the IO space is military research, because military military has been using like VR and sort of basically simulation games for a long time.
I mean, DoD has an entire like research and training wing that just builds sim games.
So there are actually many funding opportunities there. The major challenge being, well, 2 major challenges. One being it's still working with DoD, which a lot of people are just kind of morally opposed to. The other dimension being that DoD is incredibly, nepotistic isn't the word, network-based, I guess. Sure. It's all about knowing a person that's...
Yeah. It's not nepotism, it's cronyism.
Cronyism, there's the word, yeah. So that's very common. And once you're in like the DoD researcher network, suddenly you can get whatever project you want because people are like, oh, they'll get work done. It's fine. And I understand that as much as I am annoyed by it. One of the things that I was very surprised by in NSF is one of the major concerns that program officers have is once I give you $500,000, are you actually going to do anything? Because there are many projects that will take federal funding and then never finish the project because the researcher just, wanted it for tenure or whatever, and then never actually does any work and just keeps all the money. So that's a big concern in NSF. In DoD, it's the same. They don't want to spend military budgets on nothing. So the people that they've already worked with, they just trust more.
I'm sorry. I'm shocked that doesn't immediately end someone's career.
There's no consequence. I mean, let's say, for example, I got a $500,000 NSF grant to build a game.
Sure.
And then I legit spent that money on game developers or something that was within the budget I proposed. But the end result was, well, it just didn't work. Oh, well, then there's no consequence whatsoever to that happening. Other than when you apply for NSF funding again, you have to report the results of your first study, and then you're unlikely to be funded again. But there's no direct consequence. So this is more of like academia is a broken system kind of problem. But so if you need like federal funding for tenure, then the motivation is getting the grant, not doing something with the grant.
Sure.
So that it's why you see the natural filtering processes, I think, that go on where people say it's very unfair for people pre-tenure because it's more challenging to get funding in those contexts. But the reason that's happening is because there's so many people pre-tenure who don't actually want to do the projects they're proposing, that are doing it because of external incentives that they don't agree with in the first place. Like plenty of folks will say things like, I don't actually need any funding, but I have to get this project funded in order to get tenure. So I guess I'm getting a funded project now, which is insane. It's very frustrating, but so yeah, that's.
I'm just like trying to pick my jaw up off the floor.
Yeah, it's a very unhealthy system, but you can see how everything feeds into everything else. So when that happens, people then get very skeptical that a new PI is really going to do what they claim they're going to do. You also have the normal dimension of experience. Like there are plenty of submissions to NSF grants where they say things like, "Oh yeah, we will build that game, $30,000. It'll be fine." Did I lose you again?
No, I can still hear you. I can still hear you and see you. Yeah.
I think it did.
Ah, okay. Oh, you're back. Okay,
Uh,
so here's the thing. I'll just throw this in there. What seems to
mm.
be happening is you lose me, but I never lose you.
Oh, really?
So I can hear you and see you. You get a little more pixelated, but you're never dropping.
Oh, okay.
So interesting. You might just
That is.
next time it happens, just power through.
Okay.
And because I'm still getting it. Like I'm getting all your audio and all the video.
Okay.
So cool, awesome. That's good at least.
Yeah, I'm seeing myself lock up, which is very confusing. So
Interesting. Yeah, no, on my end, you just get a little blurrier. Like it just stepped down to like 240p or something.
Weird. So there are, and having done reviewing for NSF, I have seen many tech proposals that realistically they're never going to do the thing they've claimed they're trying to do. But if you don't have somebody with technical expertise in the room to comment on that, like a psych person, when you say, oh, I'm going to do this super innovative game development thing, I need $25,000 to pay a grad student for 2 semesters to build the entire game, that's not questioned. That's just like, oh, sure, that's a norm. Yeah, you pay RAs, they make things, sure, whatever. So it results in a lot of really just low quality work that I don't know why it would happen in the first place.
Yeah.
So when you're reviewing, then if you have one proposal that somebody that really knows what they're doing, even if they're young, or early on or young, and they've proposed, yeah, we're going to spend $350,000 or $500,000 of our budget on game development, and another says, oh, we can do sort of this similar thing, but we need like 30. Then to somebody that doesn't know any better, they think that, oh, well, the 30 is probably like that they're the more responsible ones. Mm-hmm. So it's a very obnoxious system in general. So gamification is an interesting one because you do see corporate funding for gamification, but that's mostly because they view it in the same way that most organizations view interventions, mm-hmm. which is, oh, we'll just throw a certain amount of money out at one time, and then that money will bring ROI, and we can estimate our ROI, and then we're done. So it's hard within that framework to say, well, we can build this game. I mean, maybe people won't like super love it at first, but then we'll iterate on it and we'll make it better and we'll customize it to the different groups you have. And they're like, that sounds very complicated. Yeah. Can you just give me a number and how much money we'll make? Yeah. So
throw a leaderboard on it.
Yeah.
Do some matches and then don't talk to me again until you have numbers to show me.
Yeah. And again, that's the incentive structure in business. Like the CEO is going to get a bigger bonus if that happens. So I understand it, but it does make operating in that space very, very tricky because you have to be able to sort of speak both languages and weave a story between the worlds that they can appreciate. Like, yes, it's going to be hard to estimate ROI on this in the beginning. Yes, costs could balloon, but we can try to keep it within a certain budget. We can target specific outcomes. We can try to ensure that all of the design steps that we're going to take are aligned carefully with that. I can't really make any promises, but if it works, here's a best case scenario. Here's a worst case scenario. That kind of language helps a lot.
Which is sadly, I've learned over the years, and I think it's just that I've been out of academia for so long. But to me, that kind of language is very natural now.
Yeah.
But I know so many people who still work in the research world who, if I gave them the opportunity to like sit in front of a person who could actually fund their dream project, just couldn't for the life of them pull it off because they don't understand how to talk like that.
Broad problem games or not. I mean, we have researchers. I even talk to the grad students because the grad students don't really appreciate it either usually in the beginning. Or I'll say things like, we want to get access to a data set, for example, which immediately in my head, I'm like, oh, that's going to incur various like data processing costs. They're going to have employees like getting stuff. We're going to deal with legal. We're going to deal like all of these layers that are problematic. But I've talked to like mid-career researchers who are like, why can't we just ask them for a data set? Like, why won't they just send it to us? Like, there's a lot of reasons, actually.
A whole bunch, really. Okay, so stepping back for a minute, right? You kind of laid out the arc of your interest, the big figurative middle finger to IO as it existed when you got started, as regards their understanding of tech and the uses of it. How did that core principle of they don't get tech, but they should, and I need to make them, how did you go from that to games?
Oh, well, I mean, games is just a long-term interest.
Okay.
I'm, I guess they call us geriatric millennials now, but
Mm.
at a very early age was very interested in playing games. I played Super Mario Brothers when I was 6 years old and was hooked. I was the kid who, when we went to like family events and other places, I would like pick up my NES and hook it up to the TV in the back room and play through the entire like Thanksgiving dinner. And
Yep.
all through high school and college, I was in the solid at least 6 hours a day, maybe 8 to 10 sometimes. Sometimes all day. Like I remember, actually, it still happens. I remember when Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, I still spent like a solid like 16 hours in sleep.
Yep.
And it was basically my whole like for 2 or 3 days. So yeah, it's just I don't know. I view games almost as a core part of like my identity. Not necessarily gamer precisely, but person who likes to play games is kind of a core idea for me.
And an important distinction that many people outside of the hobby don't necessarily grasp. Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, so that makes sense. Much the same way, right? Like many sleepless nights in elementary school playing EverQuest and going to bed at 4 a.m. and then waking up at 6 to go to school.
Did the EQ beta back in the day.
Wow.
I didn't have any money though, so I couldn't go to full EverQuest. But I was a big Ultima Online guy.
Yep.
We were super into UO.
UO, fantastic game. I joke that between EverQuest and Star Wars Galaxies, that's how I learned how to type well. Because it's like I didn't care when like I put me in computer class or whatever, but if I had to figure out how to talk to somebody quickly before they shot me or killed me in a raid or something, like typing is how you did it. But there's a jump there that I think people like us who inherently see the potential in games, we tend to compress. And I think I'm only really attuned to it because of how many people I interact with on a daily basis who don't necessarily see, I think, the connection we see, which is, that within games, within play objects generally, there are these parallels, and in these parallels, potential to improve things that to a layperson seem nothing like games at all. I think it is becoming a more common observation, either just because now we have more people who grew up playing games, so exposure, or it's just becoming more common, and so people have exposure to the idea, let alone more games themselves. But I don't know. I mean, I remember doing like my thesis and realizing that me wanting to incorporate games in any way whatsoever seemed insane to the entire IO program. And I questioned myself, well, like, how did I come to make that connection? Where did that start? Because I think in that question is the answer to so much of the drive to make this thing work. Right? Why do we see this thing that so many people still don't? And if we can answer that, can we use that answer to help other people see it?
I mean, that's trying to do that is a big part of what I view my sort of practice-oriented work in relation to gamification being. I mean, I was just on like a podcast interview this morning, and one of the major things that I was talking about for them was they have very little game experience. So I was trying to draw parallels to just like film and stories and such. So imagining, for example, each employee in an organization as essentially a protagonist in a story. Like they have essentially goals, missions, purposes that they're trying to achieve. And what if you were watching a film and a protagonist ran into a problem where they said, "Oh, now I'm going to have to wait 6 hours before I get an answer on a thing." that would make a bad story, and they wouldn't want to be in that story anymore, and you would find it boring. Like, it's the same concept, imagining the sort of individuals within an organization as each being the heroes in their own personal narrative within this organization, and how, if you were going to design a better narrative for them, how could you help them do that, and what barriers could you remove from them, and what ways could you support them to create their own story through this organization. So trying to communicate that, I think I'm motivated to do that in part because I have been part of so many sort of amazing stories, like to feel like you're part of the Fallout universe, to feel like you're, actually doing the things that you see in these games, in a really high quality game that pulls you in like a flow state, and you lose hours and hours to it. The power of that to a person who plays a lot of games is very obvious. And I don't know any real clear way to explain it. I still struggle with it, other than to say, well, you should probably play more games. But trying to draw parallels and say, like, imagine, I like the hero terminology. Imagine that every employee or every person that's looking for a job or whatever else it might be is a hero in their story. How are you making them stop being a hero? How does their narrative get interrupted because of things that you're doing? And how can you make that narrative more enjoyable, more compelling? How can you help them set goals that they actually care about rather than goals that you've imposed on them? Like, there's so many parallels to what to game design. That's the window I try to go through to say, like, it's not that, especially in gamification, it's not that any of the lessons from gamification are altogether unique and new. It's that they have been honed in the context of games, and we can take lessons from there and use those to make work a better place. And, like, for example, one of the things that we already know from games is that points alone not going to do a whole lot. Like, just if I give you 10 times as many points for the same thing you were doing before, you're not going to be 10 times as motivated. Yeah. Why do you think giving points to your employees is going to matter? Like, why would you care? So, like, a lot of it is about convincing people, like, just because it's games doesn't mean it's not, like, a serious, important, big thing. It's not that the lessons aren't real. It's not that the lessons are somehow, like, I don't know, flighty, or I'm trying to actively avoid the word serious because I hate the term serious games, but trying to convince people that this is something legitimate and worth paying attention to. That's been my way in. Actually, every talk I give on gamification, I even start with numbers. Okay. Because I'm like, I know this audience isn't going to just care if I start talking about games. So I'm like, do you know what's expensive? Making Grand Theft Auto 5. Here is the budget for that. Here's how they've made 1.5 trillion over the past decade. Yeah. Why did that happen? What is it about that experience? And in an interactive experiences, people are like, well, people like to be criminals. I'm like, is that really it? Are you sure that's what it is? Because it's not what it is.
We don't have, we don't have, hundreds of millions of people out in the street playing cops and robbers with, like, sticks. There's don't get me wrong, I think we might be a better society if we had more people engaging with imaginative play that doesn't require technological assistance, but, like, sure, that's not where we are. Okay, so I think there's some term clarification that probably should occur, not necessarily for you or me, but just for anyone watching this, because this is not going toward, like, an expert audience, right? So gamification, games. One of the more recent papers that your name was on that was in ResearchGate was about breaking apart gamification into different kind of concepts that, it's not all the same.
Yeah.
How do you see gamification now? As someone who works in it, in games as well as gamification, how do you structure your thoughts around it? Like, what are the bins?
So, yeah. So the ways that I think about it, and the way that I try to present it to audiences that don't know much about games, well, most people still know games, they just don't think they know games. Sure. So I usually introduce the concept of gameplay loops, that in any game you have some sort of iterative process that you are doing multiple times usually with variations around that core sort of loop of behavior, whatever it might be. And that for something to be a game, there really needs to be a loop of some sort. And they really vary a lot, but you can see the easy examples. I usually use Scrabble as an example because, there's a turn,
draw
there's a
tile, play a word.
Yeah, every time it's that same process, and then it goes between people, and there's certain victory conditions and so on, and that those are the common features associated with games. And that when we gamify, we take some subset of those features associated with games and apply them in a place that we normally wouldn't see them. So there's often no gameplay loop. Like points is an interesting one because I've seen it implemented without any sort of like loop concept. Which is weird. It feels strange to me, but to say like, we have a message board or discussion board, and you're going to get points every time that you post on it. It's like a pseudo loop. It's like behavior that you would have already engaged in. Like sometimes you post, sometimes you leave, sometimes you come back, you reply to somebody, but now there's points.
Yeah.
Like that's an example of like bad gamification. Like there's no reason to do that. It's not going to really change anybody's behavior except on a couple of edge cases. And of the people who do change their behavior, it's not for any good reason. Yeah. It's changing the goal from engagement to getting points. And some people are motivated by points. That's fine. But, or from the recognition associated with points, I guess. So yeah, that's the bad example of gamification. Yeah. Leaderboards in places where leaderboards aren't really justified is another. Sure. Where you take the point concept and you just throw a leaderboard into a thing. Leaderboards are pretty relatable though, which is useful for explaining gamification, especially in the context of sales jobs, because there are a lot of sort of commission-based sales jobs that'll do things, especially in realty, that a realtors will have like, you got a certain number of dollars of sales. There's no points, but it's basically points. Sure. Dollars of sales for this like unit or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, what is a sales commission but points? It's just points that actually you can take into the counter and buy things with.
Yes. Yes. And all the unhealthy things that could come up with having that kind of relationship with points and leaderboards. Yeah. You still have realty firms that will do things like, you're on suspension if you get at the bottom of the leaderboard, and if you're at the bottom 2 terms in a row, you get fired. Like all sorts of crazy stakes.
Stack ranking is inherently a leaderboard, right?
Yes. So it's a very relatable version, but I hate it. I really. Yeah. I think points, badges, and leaderboards can be used in very clever ways that actually do help, but it's very hard to do right. It's hard to identify goals that are sort of, I've written about it, it's sort of like secondary supporting goals, like things that are not directly rewarded by your job, but if you did them, I bet your job would be better. Like that's the kind of sweet spot, I think, for that kind of behavior. Like, I don't know. I'm designing on the fly, so I shouldn't do that. But I'm thinking about situations like, I don't know. No, that's manipulative. I don't want to say that one.
I mean, I'll give an example, right? So, working with an organization to build a gamified platform to basically turn large group living situations into ones that reward positive roommate behaviors. So, you can gamify a chore wheel. It is not integral to being necessarily a good roommate. Plenty of people have good roommates who don't do chores. But if they also do chores, they're probably slightly better roommate. That layer of, nice to have, not critical.
Yeah. It's there's a working paper by Nancy Rothbard and Malik, I think, is first author. Okay. Where they talk about the concept of mandatory fun, which to me means it's not very gameful experience for a person if it's mandatory.
I mean, dig back into game studies lit, and I think it's probably Kalwa who starts it, right? Like mandatory play isn't play. If there isn't optionality around engaging in the activity, it's categorically not play.
Yeah. And so in working in the organizational context, you still have to ask the question of whether it's play or not, or a game or not. Is it still reaching the outcomes it's designed to reach? Sure. Which is not necessarily play or fun, which is an interesting dimension of it. But I can see examples. There are numerous examples of where even implementing, for example, play objects is not a good idea, or at least it doesn't do what people think it does. Like the prototype that I always think of is the Google's edition of foosball tables. Now there's a fun room at Google. Great. It's sort of this almost mindless. I shouldn't say mindless. This incompletely considered network of effects of trying to create play opportunities and create fun or force fun on people in order to manipulate their behavior. So that voluntary aspect of it becomes very critical to me. But both ethically at the foundation, but also even practically, that if you want to have something that really motivates people, they have to feel like they've made the choice to engage with it. And if they don't feel like they've made that choice, then they're always it's just going to feel like another part of their job. Like there's no, it's like, oh, so it's like Flair in Office Space. Like, are you required to have fun now?
Yeah. Getting demerits for not having enough flair, getting demerits for not engaging with your game that the company provides you sufficiently enough.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so how do you get people? Okay, so there are two. I'm imagining walking through a potentially interested individual, like a client, if someone wanted to contract you for private work, right? So there's stage one, which is explaining what the hell the thing even is, right? What is this idea? What is introducing play into our workplace? But then there's always at least as I'm imagining it, the much more difficult idea, which is, okay, they get the concept, but there are all these ways that they can get the concept and immediately think of just terrible ways to implement it that will either have no effect or very strong negative effects.
Mm-hmm.
How do you walk someone back out of that?
I wish I had a easy answer to that.
Sure. Yeah.
So I guess I personally at least have the advantage of being in a space where when people come to me with so I have a consultancy, and so when people approach me in that regard, they already have a problem they don't think they can solve. So it's generally relatively easy from my side. At that point, they say something like, "We added leaderboards and it didn't work." So that's an easy starting point. I'm like, yes, I could have told you that before you did it. So I don't have to fight that fight very often. Occasionally, we will hit roadblocks where we'll be trying to implement, or I'll give an advice on how to implement something, and then they will sort of like right turn from it slightly in a way that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I don't think there's any single piece of advice for getting out of that. Other than all I ever do is basically say, all right, well, let's try to imagine what would actually happen in this scenario. And let's use essentially psychological research to say, well, how would people feel about this? And why would they feel that way? You can see an echo of it in some of the work we've done in relation to like psychological mediators. Like it's not that the game just makes you behave differently. There's something in the middle. It's make you feel different. It's motivating you differently. Maybe you feel more comfortable. You feel less anxious. You feel something. And it's that feeling that is integral to making whatever it is work. So I say, all right, you want to give points. Actually, a good example we did in training evaluation. They were using points in leaderboards for finishing training modules. Okay. And it was resulting in more training module completion, but people were spending like 20 seconds on a training module, which obviously is not what they were going for. So I would say, well, why is the leaderboard there? And what is the leaderboard for? And they say things like, oh, well, anybody that's at the highest end of the leaderboard each month gets like I can't remember what it was. It was something like a voucher for the company store or whatever, maybe an Applebee's coupon, something like that. And say, okay, so what you're saying is you've set up a system to reward people to click on the finish button more times in order to get this coupon you're offering. And they're like, yes, that is what we're doing. So I say, is that what you want to be doing? And that becomes a good entry point into saying, okay, maybe we need to better articulate what you're actually trying to make happen here, and then design some game mechanics around making that happen rather than this easy proxy you identified that you could pay some vendor. You're paying like $1,000 a month for access to this weird gamification platform. Maybe instead of doing that, we actually build something internal customized to your actual needs rather than just sticking this on the top. And maybe that platform will still work for you, but we have a lot of work to do before we can actually answer that question. And that's usually a pretty good ramp in. you have all the normal sort of human challenges of they've already invested in something or they've already thought it out to a certain degree, and trying to redirect them without making them feel stupid. Like that's always the challenge. It's like, I see why you would have thought that would have worked, and let me walk you through why I know that won't work, and let's direct you to something different.
So something that occurs to me is, and it's certainly not limited to gamification, but I think it was very, very noticeable. It's what gave gamification a bad rap there for a while before we kind of started circling back around on it and it started getting some open eyes again. Low-hanging fruit, right? The desire to implement the easiest mechanics absent any context or a core loop was, of course, the path we were going to go down, right? It's always the path we're going to go down. It's how people think about organizational purchases, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But is there low-hanging fruit that actually is effective? Is a question I struggle with, or really is it do customization and development time and effort, all these things, the more you put in, you're going to have a higher chance of having a better success. But for the orgs that don't have the time or the budget or any number of other things that might affect this, right? Is there something that they can layer in that isn't shit?
Yeah. So yes, usually, not always.
Sure.
The thing is that most of the techniques in gamification that do work are really based on other existing techniques, not based on, but they're very closely related to existing techniques that we already know work really well. So goal setting is probably the classic example where it goes all the way back to work by like the Lock and Latham kind of work on logger trucks and going into these logging firms, and they're just kind of filling this log up truck as much as they want. And management says, oh, it's actually really expensive for you to just fill it up however much you want. And they say, hey guys, go for 95% full every time. And then if you consistently get 95% all day, then at the end, I'm going to tell you, good job. And that's basically it.
Yeah.
And that much intervention is enough to say, oh, I guess, man, they really value us doing this. And if we can hit that line every time, then they'll appreciate us more. And that's a perfectly normal exchange and doesn't seem manipulative because you're literally telling them what you want. And to gamify that in a way, all the way down to the silliest gamification that literally everyone has, which is like number of days since the last accident written on a number on the side of the building. Yep. Like, it's just simple recognition of goals being achieved or not achieved. So that's totally fine. And you definitely get diminishing returns as you move beyond that point. So if you're trying to motivate specific behaviors, then goal setting works pretty well. And building a massive infrastructure of game on top of that might help if you do it well, might not, kind of arguable. The approaches that are going to be give you greater return, I think, are the ones that are more all-encompassing, like the narrativization kind of path. So in recruitment, for example, looking into saying, you know what, how we currently recruit people is we get their email addresses, we invite them to apply, then they go to a website, they fill out a form, they don't hear from us for 3 weeks, then we get back to them with an invitation to do an asynchronous interview on a website, they do that, they don't hear from us for 3 more weeks, and then we just say, hired or not hired, get in here. Maybe instead of that, we should think about their kind of journey through the process as a narrative structure, and to say when they're entering, they're essentially feeling like, oh, it's basically like I've opened a door to this organization. What do I see there? And right now you're telling them a big lot of nothing. Like they're seeing nothing. They're seeing you're being ignored. Like all of those feelings would not create an engaging experience for them. So maybe we think about how we can modify that so that they do get pulled in. That kind of overarching change can do things that simple goals and even gamification based on goals is not going to accomplish. Yeah. So yeah, it really depends on the exact situation, like what specific problem they're trying to solve in order to figure out, is there going to be a low-hanging fruit to reach for? There are definitely going to be organizations whose cultures are just broken. And then going in there and saying, hey, can we gamify? Like, no, you'll just break your culture even more by doing that. So definitely don't. Yeah. But from the inside, it's often hard to see that. Short version of all that. Sometimes sometimes there's a low-hanging fruit, but it definitely requires some diagnosis, needs assessment, really diagnosing what's going on with the organization before trying to do something like that.
Okay, so this is a bit of an odd one. What are the core competencies of the people who you've encountered who are doing this work? Where are the gaps? Who are going in doing either as a consultancy like you, gamification, or are simply people who already work in an organization and have an interest in this. Obviously, an understanding of baseline psychological literature.
Yeah.
Not a bad thing to have because, as you mentioned, right, a lot of the easiest gamification is taking things that we already know work, just doing a little bit more, doing it a little bit different. But like, say you're looking at a slate of grad students, and hypothetically, they're all interested in working in your lab. They all want to do some work with your consultancy, however you want to frame it. They have an interest in games, gamification, this kind of aspect. What's the skill set that you think is most important that you see least represented in the people who are coming your way?
This is specifically about grad students?
Doesn't have to be. Just people who are interested in implementing that. That was an available example.
Yeah, grad students introduces a different problem.
Sure.
There has to be a general interest in doing IO psychology, which I seem to get like this very big discrepancy. There's a certain number of folks that apply that are like, I love games, but I don't care about like the actual substance of the degree, which is a problem because I know they're going to struggle and they're not going to care about like performance appraisal and all the other like random things they have to learn and be an expert in, and they're probably going to flame out very spectacularly. So that's one side of who I get. And the other side are people who are like, I read your profile and I saw the word game, and that sounds like something that'll be good for my career. And have no exposure otherwise. I'm reasonably confident at this point in my ability to train that problem away. I can teach people enough about games where I'm not so worried about that. I am less confident in my ability to overcome somebody who only wants to do games. So that's been the struggle that we've had a few times with students. So getting into this into the space as a practitioner, there's an interesting. I think you're right that it requires sort of a blend in perspectives, that you have to have. I don't want to say empathy. It's kind of empathy. You have to have some empathy. Be able to actually, on one side, understand the psychological sort of complexity of a person and appreciate what's going on in their head. In terms of evaluating when you do something that's going to affect their work on like a daily basis, how will they feel about it and why might they feel that way? And that's built on both a combination of, don't like the word emotional intelligence, emotional skill, let's say, a combination of that and knowledge of like an organizing framework. So like how are emotions expressed? How are attitudes formed? All your basic psychological kind of theories about why people feel things, essentially. So there's that foundation. And then you build on that a knowledge of the toolkit of the specific game mechanics that are available to you, for example, and then blend those together in order to create something better. I often see a lot of, I think in the world of like gamification platforms, I often see people more on the pure tech side. They're like, we know that points exist. We know that leaderboards exist. We know that these are called mechanics, and we have made a platform that supplies them. But when you ask them, well, what are you going to do about it? Like, how do you actually make this organization function better? They say, oh, well, we put our platform in. What do you mean? Like, the platform will make things better. And there's no appreciation of like the underlying design components or the complexity of the humans that you're trying to influence. And is very limiting. The other side is also limiting. Like somebody coming in, and I see this on the IO side because I'm in conference meetings with these people. IOs will come in who have extensive knowledge of like motivational interventions and such. I'm like, well, why don't we layer this inside a more all-encompassing kind of strategy for really managing how people experience whatever it is we're talking about. And they're so unfamiliar with the tools and so unfamiliar with the technologies involved that they just have no frame of reference for what I'm talking about. And then we have to go many steps back in order to even introduce that. And I often face this question of, is it worth it? do I even try? And sometimes in gamification context, I don't even call it gamification. Like I just use the language of IO motivational interventions and do like, why don't we try this thing over here? I know a study that did something like that, and try not to even mention the word game because it just immediately flips a switch in some people's heads for whatever reason. I think the people that are best at this tend to be able to empathize with their users, essentially, have some of those core, like almost art-based UX skills, and then know the toolkit that they are potentially applying to the situation, and also understand the psychology of work itself, why people are motivated, how they function in a work environment. I think a lot of people naively assume things like, well, the reason that you try at work is because you're getting paid. Like, that's part of it. Yeah. Not the whole thing,
extrinsic rewards do motivate people, but like that's not all of it. Otherwise, people would work only the highest paid, most miserable jobs they could.
Right. And since we mentioned Office Space, it's the strategy. It makes you work just hard enough not to get fired. That's the line.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's so much more to it, and having exposure to that and understanding why people work and why people find meaning in their. I mean, even if you don't personally find meaning in the job you're in right now, doesn't mean other people don't. Sure. I used, like when I was in high school, for example, I viewed it so suspiciously. I was like, when people like their work, they're lying, like just by default. And it took a long time for me to appreciate, well, a lot of people do legitimately enjoy what they're doing, and they would probably even do it for less money because they enjoy it so much. And some people would do it for free. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many volunteer organizations and altruism going on in the work world. And trying to understand, well, what is it about that person and about the work and about the situation they're in and about the design of their job that leads them to have that reaction to it? And how can you encourage other people to have that same reaction? Not in a manipulative way, which is the risk in gamification. It's not forcing them to like their job. It's saying, well, how can I help you see what you went into this field for a reason, like you took this job because you thought you would enjoy it. Well, what is it about the specific job you're in that's causing that not to happen? And how can we improve that experience for you?
Yeah. I keep thinking, what does a primer look like? Right? Because part of me suspects, and it might just be that I'm so sold on it already, probably is, but there's such a self-evident nature to the good something like this can do when implemented well. Right? It doesn't require even a stretch of the imagination for me. And repeatedly that has been my experience when people do finally grasp what the hell I'm even talking about. Is there is that light bulb moment, oh God, that would be fantastic. But there does seem this very real burden to skilling up individuals enough in the multidisciplinary ways that they need to for people to be useful practitioners.
You cut out and now you're talking, so I can't hear you if you can hear me.
I can't hear you.
See, still nothing.
All right, I'm back?
You're back now.
Damn it. So okay,
very real burden, multidisciplinary.
Nothing. All right, very real burden of multidisciplinary skills that we need to build up in an individual for them to be a useful practitioner. And what does a primer look like to get someone, part of the way there? Because I think the long version is, years of training and study, and it's unrealistic to expect enough people to go through that for us to make the size of impact. I think in an abstract way, the theories and the field could. So what's the minimum viable product version of a primer that gets somebody there?
Yeah,
I don't know. And it's not even a question for you to answer necessarily. It's a thought that haunts me.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that it's such a nice vision to want it to be accessible. I don't know that I would agree that's necessary. In part because in the world of work that we're in, the stakes are so critically high that a bad move can harm actively hundreds or thousands of people in many of these kind of places.
Yeah.
So to me, I'm like, maybe there should be a little bit of gatekeeping on that particular problem. Because it's not like I feel like the traditional arc for like game design is you get kind of the basics either from your own experience or from like a programming game design, and then there's this long sort of arc of your growth of your skills where you're interested in game direction. Maybe you make your own a couple little games. You learn a lot of hard lessons along the way. That arc, when it comes down to, well, maybe you're going to make this employee completely miserable. They're going to quit their job and they're going to have to find more things for their family. Like the stakes are like very different.
Very different. Yeah.
So I get really nervous when folks just want to jump straight into like people management. I mean, I'm already very nervous of HR in general because a lot of people go into HR with a similar sort of like lack of experience.
Yeah.
That folks can go in with a college degree in business admin where they've taken no psychology, they've taken one HR class, if that, and then suddenly they're responsible for like managing people's salary and benefits. I'm like, I'm a little nervous about that. So I don't know. In this space, I think to manage employees in that way, I do get a little nervous about it. That said, I think there are many useful lessons that maybe this kind of primer idea would be useful for when talking about like team management, where if you're a manager and you've got like 10 people, maybe that's an okay sort of test bed to try out some of these things. That's like your little indie projects that you start fresh out of college kind of idea. That kind of environment, maybe there should be better materials to help people, figure out what's possible. I think it's still the same list though. Basic psychology, basic sort of inventory of game elements and game mechanics. That's still risky because of, I don't know. I find a key problem I hit is that when I say, here's a list of example game mechanics, and then they'll treat it like a taxonomy, like, oh, so there's 8 game mechanics.
Sure, yeah.
Not what I'm saying, different thing. So I'm nervous about too much primariness in the sense that you can convince people that things are much simpler than they really are. And that can be just as dangerous.
Yeah, it really is enough knowledge to harm, not enough to help. Sort of problem.
Or to help by chance.
Sure. Yeah.
It's sort of the same. I mean, I think there are indie developers even that have made really phenomenal, amazing games almost by accident. Like they had a really amazing idea, and they just happened to hit the right combination of circumstances to make it work.
Yeah.
And then you don't see that kind of output very much after that.
And that is just as true for organizations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're going to be managers with those same kind of experiences. They're going to be motivational designers or gamification folks with that same experience. But man,
it's a very good point. I guess I don't take the cautious view enough with it. I'm a little too sold on it, but no, you're right. It's a very real problem. You can very seriously screw up some people's lives.
Yeah, you're imagining yourself doing it.
Yeah.
You're not. I'm thinking of all the managers that I've talked to who they say things like, my employees aren't working hard enough, so I made them stay in longer hours so that they would, work harder. Like I see that logic, and I think of what would that person do if given like a gamification toolkit, and I'm a little horrified. So there's definitely a line there. I get nervous about. Yeah.
Okay, so final thing, because you got to go. You've given me a good amount of your time, but you had given me up until an hour, and we are 12 minutes away. So I don't know. Final words, right? Like again, the people watching this are not going to be fellow IOs probably. Also, probably not going to be professional game devs. Mostly the people who watch this are people who are just interested in knowing more about like who the hell makes games of any sort, you know.
Sure.
But I will say a lot of people have expressed interest in, you know, how games can fit into their lives, and for a lot of people, their lives are dominated by their work.
Yeah.
You know, you over the years, you've done this a lot. You've worked with a lot of different people. You've worked in academic environments. You have a consultancy. Like, you've seen more of a spread than most people will in their entire lives when it comes to this topic already, and you're not that old. Like final,
thanks for that.
Yeah. Kind of final words. Like, what would you like people to know?
Man, I think we're in a really exciting time, especially for game development in all contexts. And it plays out in the world of work as much as it plays out in entertainment. I have been recently really obsessed with a little iPhone game, although I think it just came out on Switch, called Sky, which is from the makers of Journey.
Yep.
Also a really excellent experience, which really turns a lot, for me at least, turns a lot of sort of classic game mechanics kind of on their head. You know, it's a game so tightly focused on cooperation and facilitation of social relationships, and it's not about a lot of the things that we see sort of in the mainstream game space. It really sticks out to me as being unusual. But I also see it as one of many games that's in an opening salvo of this sort of new era of game design, where I think we've diversified enough to start seeing. And game design still is not as diverse as it really should be, but it's diversified enough where we're seeing different perspectives on what a enjoyable, engaging experience is. And as we see that diversity increase, as we see more people experimenting with how do we get people to enjoy these kinds of experiences, so too will we see the advantages in work contexts, and in other contexts beyond that. You know, we're right at the beginning of, I gotta remember the name of it. Not Persuasive. Games. It's like games for a purpose. Games with a purpose. There's the term. Okay. So things like, can we design something that helps? Can we design a game or a gameful experience that helps people, it encourages them to engage in philanthropic type activities? So there's a game out there that's like classifying galaxies or looking at DNA, and you put game mechanics on top of that to help facilitate people through that experience. We're already seeing this sort of explosion in interest in what I would think of as a non-traditional game experience that kind of challenges what we classically think of as a game. In the same way that many years ago, you know, Half-Life challenged the notion of narrative and said, you know, we can bring you into this world. It's not just go shoot stuff. It's now an actual living environment that you're a part of. And we've seen changes in more recent years in more and more social components and more integrative sort of experiences. We've also seen the downside of that in some really horrible mobile games, but there's the amount of change going on and the amount of growth and the amount of experimentation is just really exciting. And you locked up, so I'm not 100% sure that you can still hear me.
I am. I can. Yeah, I can.
There you go.
You kept going. Yeah, it was fine.
That means that I think we're right at the beginning, and I think there's a huge amount of potential for even people that aren't really into games yet to take some of the lessons they're seeing in playing the games that are being released now, and take those lessons back to the experiences they're having in work, to even, you know, as people move into positions with more authority, as they get a little older, more likely to be in, like, you know, manager role, to think about how can I engage people in the way that games engage me. And even that can have an enormous impact on someone's life in a way that, you know, I was motivated a lot by saying, I want to do this technology research. I was excited about games. I wanted to publish about games, and nobody cared. It then became my mission to say, well, how do I roll out the carpet behind me so that other people with that excitement from an earlier age can walk down that same path and not feel that discouragement? So I think that even the people who are, you know, stuck in jobs they're not super excited about, they're still on that path, and there's still a great deal of potential to take those lessons and what excites them and help those behind them in the ways they didn't experience it, to bring that experience to them. So yeah, I don't know that I'm in full like McGonagall mode of games can save the world thing.
Most of us aren't.
Yeah, there is so much potential that is untapped, and the idea that we can all just appreciate, I mean, the simple idea that we should take time and effort to appreciate how others experience things differently than us. Like that's a core part of games to me, and that lesson can't hurt in any context. So just wherever somebody is, wherever you are, and whatever you're doing, thinking about how, and maybe this is what gamification should be, thinking about how those lessons about connectivity and engagement and excitement and what really pokes at somebody's passions to really get them excited, to think about how to take advantage of that to help people find their own paths and find their own excitement, and then take that further in the generations that come behind them. That's what I hope for. That's why I still, even despite the funding challenges, is why I still try to do this kind of games research, because I want to help that mission become more obvious. So yeah, I hope everyone, regardless of what they do, has that same kind of appreciation, or can build that same kind of appreciation for games.
I like that. I very much like that as what gamification should be for.
Yeah.
I'm probably gonna steal it, just to let you know.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, dude. Well, after 6+ years of circling around one another and tweeting at each other, it's good to finally put an in motion face to the name. Thank you for this. I had a great time.
Yeah, this has been fun.
Well, I look forward to, I don't know, whatever the hell you do next.
We'll see.
I have, yeah. So also very glad to know that your stuff is all up on ResearchGate. So now I can access it easy peasy whenever. All right, dude. Be well. Thank you again. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's been good. Bye.
Bye.